In this presentation, our group has chosen to explore Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s with an emphasis on one of his many hallmarks on society, peaceful protesting. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most well-known and recognized civil rights advocates in history. Born January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, King came from a long line of pastors of the Ebenezer Baptist Church and would also become a pastor as an adult. King was well educated. He received his doctorate at Boston University in 1955. It was in Boston that he met his wife, Coretta Smith, and began his family, eventually fathering 3 children. By 1954, King was a member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In 1955, King helped orchestrate one of the most impactful and recognized peaceful protests in history, the Montgomery bus boycott. This boycott lasted 382 days and resulted in the desegregation of public transit. Following this historical landmark were many other peaceful protests of King's, as well as his most highly acclaimed I Have a Dream speech. King spent a majority of his life advocating against racism and for the rights of Black individuals, despite the imminent danger it put him in. He was assassinated in 1968 while continuing this fight. In highlighting MLK's connection to scientific racism, I first offer a quote from Nature Cancer's Speaking Up Against Inequality and Racism. It reads, "The unvarnished reality is that inequalities cut deeply through biomedical science and patient care, with a devastating impact on individuals and communities." This quote brings to light the real-life implications of scientific racism and the reality that race science does affect marginalized communities. Scientific racism has historically acted as a foundation of segregation. Throughout this course, we have studied many physicians with racial prejudices that use science to justify this mistreatment of people of color. For example, in week 5, we studied a man named Frederick Hoffman, who wrote various scientific papers and publications. Hoffman was notoriously racist and believed that miscegenation, otherwise known as the interbreeding of different races, would lead to the downfall of America. In his papers, he argued and defended the ideal that African Americans should experience greater discriminations, especially through the insurance industry. This example of the use of race science to perpetuate discriminatory ideals was the foundation of the fight MLK was fighting.
MLK had a pretty interesting style and way of approaching the act of protesting in his time period. His peaceful take on how to create and bolster change for a people was an innovative and almost unheard of idea for America in the 1950s. To understand why his style of protesting was so effective and impactful, I think it's important to know some examples of his protests first. The first example of a protest led by Dr. King was the Montgomery bus boycott. Taking place in Montgomery, Alabama, King exercised a boycott on the public transportation system in which African Americans refused to take public transit. This was put in place to protest segregated seating and is generally regarded as the first wide-scale protest against segregation. The second example is the protests used in the Birmingham campaign. This campaign is probably the most notable example of Dr. King's approach when it comes to nonviolent acts of protesting. Dr. King's community joined the already pre-existing fight and arranged for sit-ins at lunch tables and kneel-ins in libraries. They also carried out marches on the city hall and downtown, and possibly the most impactful example would be the encouragement of children to march downtown to protest segregation. Now, there's a lot of things that can be attributed to why Dr. King's protests were so effective and what made them so unique. What caused change in many of these protests wasn't necessarily the actions that took place by the protesters themselves, but the reactions given by the racists who resisted change and enforced segregation. What's interesting about Dr. King's protests is he himself strongly advised the people protesting to not act in violence, but the reactions given by the people opposing were often aggressive and almost terrorizing. For instance, in the Birmingham campaign, when hundreds of young children marched to protest downtown, many of them were arrested on the first day. And when hundreds more joined and marched again the following day, they were met with the frontal force of police and the fire department using hoses, clubs, and even canines to take down literal children. So what caused change here wasn't the fact that the people were marching downtown. It was the brutal reactions that these children were met with, which ultimately gained media coverage and led to international uproar. This exact method was actually touched on by Dr. King while he was in jail. He did get arrested in Birmingham, um, but in a letter he sent from solitary confinement, he's quoted as stating, "Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community who has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored." So basically, what we can gather from this quote is that Dr. King's whole approach to protesting is to bring an issue, in this case segregation and civil rights, to the point where it gets so bad and serious that it's impossible to not address and take action on it.
Peaceful versus violent protesting. The different types of protesting between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. These two were very different political leaders and motivators when it came to their movements. For Malcolm X, he was a black supremacist whose main belief was to make African American people superior to white people. Malcolm X also believed that non-violent methods were too slow to achieve progress and signified weakness. He strongly believed in black pride and that African Americans should achieve their goals by any means necessary. Malcolm X was a leader who had a lot of strong beliefs. So obviously MLK was. However, Malcolm was very adamant as to doing whatever it took for his people to quote unquote win. Meanwhile, for Martin Luther King Jr., he was somebody who believed more in racial equality and mixing races, having races be cohesive, and rather than battling against each other like it was war, he instead wanted to have people work together. Much more of a peacemaker than Malcolm X was. MLK also believed that non-violent resistance was the key to ending all violence and racial hatred in order to eventually achieve equality between the two races. These two were very different leaders and political figures. Examples of peaceful protests in the past, two that I wanted to highlight. The first one was the women's suffrage procession on March 3rd, 1913. This was big back then as gender equality was trying to be motivated and pushed for. On March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration, thousands of women marched alongside Pennsylvania Avenue, the same route that the inaugural parade would take the next day. This was huge, and it was definitely a powerful movement for the women, and this protest ended up being very successful. 7 years later, an amendment would be upheld that would allow women to vote, and this protest ended up being, like I said, very successful, and it has stayed this way since, and the protest has been intact ever since. The Montgomery bus boycott, with this, obviously, Rosa Parks was not in her correct seat in the bus, and that, of course, led her to being arrested and led to this boycott happening. The goal was to limit racial segregation and inequality for Black Americans, especially in the South. And this was a big deal in the 60s. It was very important, especially with the current American civil rights movement at the moment. and it definitely shaped the way that we live today. This protest was a success and ended up being served as the impetus for the civil rights movement later on. The impact that protests have on mental health. A source we read in class by Sarah Jacoby called How Racism Affects Mental Health and What We Can Do About It. Jacoby does a great job of analyzing the dynamic between racism and how it affects mental health, not only with just black people, but with any type of race. And according to the data from close to 300 studies on the topic, found that racism was undoubtedly linked to poor mental health, higher rates of depression, anxiety, and stress. Again, disapproval from people can cause people to feel anxiety and struggle with mental health. Mental health is such a barrier that we have to get through in today's world. So it's really important that we take note of that.
Now we will be focusing on recent protesting in society today. From George Floyd's murder in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, marking in history as one of the largest social movements in history, to the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2020, to the Atlanta spa shootings, an act of racial-motivated violence toward the Asian population, and most recently the overturnment of Roe v. Wade, an action that puts women's reproductive rights at jeopardy, sparking protests all over the nation that are still continuing today. These are all examples that are a great way at looking at how our society handles their protests. In regards to peaceful protesting, you can find that we are pretty successful when looking at the statistics from Black Lives Matter. There were more than 7,750 Black Lives Matter demonstrations in all 50 states that took place between the dates May 26th to August 22nd, 2020. And according to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, their report has shown that 93% of the Black Lives Matter protests have remained peaceful. This is the type of peaceful protesting MLK would hope to see in our society. However, our protests are not always peaceful. There were many aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement that were very violent. At least 25 Americans were killed while protesting. Cars, businesses, and homes were vandalized and set on fire. This could be seen as a representation of Malcolm X's way of protesting, talked about earlier in the presentation. The acts of violence towards those who were murdered were mostly from anti-Black Lives Matter protesters. This can relate to what we have learned about in class when it comes to society's underlying beliefs and negative perspectives towards people of color, specifically African Americans. One more example of protesting that wasn't so peaceful was the Capitol riot on January 6, 2020. There were 5 murdered and the Capitol was stormed with large amounts of vandalism, physical aggression, and gun violence. The power peaceful protesting has on our society today is very beneficial. According to the United States Institute of Peace, nonviolent resistance has shown to be twice as effective than armed struggle in achieving major political goals. Peaceful protesting ensures attendance by creating a safe place for people to stand for what they believe in.